I clicked start, did it not? Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. This is Marcia Nedlin, and we're just going to wait for the attendees to come into the Zoom, and then we'll get started. Hey, April. As you're coming into the room, it would be great if you, excuse me, typed into the chat where you're from. Oh, the chat is disabled right now. Can we undisable the chat? This seems to be happening at every webinar I've attended lately. I'm not sure what that's about. We do have the, excuse me, the Q&A. It looks like the chat might, there we go. Maybe open now. So as if you're in the room, it would be great to hear where you're from. Red Lodge, Montana. Hey, Jacob. Hi, Rosalie. Hi, Mark. Tacoma Park. I don't know. I think it was like, I can remember a colleague living there some years ago when it was first established as a nuclear-free zone. Hi, Jennifer. Nuclear-free and proud. That's right. Hey, David, also from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. That's great. If you've just joined us, we're just waiting for everyone to get into the room, and we're requesting that you type into the chat where you're tuning in from. And Rob, hey, Rob, from NeighborWorks Salt Lake, one of the case study organizations that we're going to talk about today. Okay, let's go ahead and, hey, Mike, I saw that your name on the registration is so nice of you to join us. Let's go ahead and get started. So again, I'm Marcia Nedlin. I am one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. Go ahead, Anne, and let's see who can, oh, I was gonna say who can guess where that photo's from, but it said it right in the slide. So maybe that won't be too much of a challenge. Anyway, the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative. So we are a national initiative that's focused on mobilizing attention to middle neighborhoods, which are, generally speaking, those neighborhoods in your community that are not the most distressed, and neither are they the healthiest neighborhoods. They're those that are kind of on the edge between you know, stability and decline, or in many cases, including the cases we're going to talk about today, on the verge of gentrification. So we found in our work that middle neighborhoods were often thought to be kind of on autopilot and not needing any attention, but first by accident and then by intention, we've discovered that many middle neighborhoods throughout the nation are disappearing, and they're doing that either through decline because no one's paying attention to them, or through gentrification, perhaps because too many people are paying attention to them. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. The Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is a joint project of the National Community Stabilization Trust and NeighborWorks America. We have this community of practice that facilitates peer-to-peer learning among practitioners. It's open to everyone to join. Please consider joining us. You can go to middleneighborhoods.org, and at the bottom of any of our web pages, you can sign up to be in the community of practice. We connect people through webinars like this, as well as newsletters and small group meetings with researchers, case studies, virtual site visits, all that kind of stuff. We also do research into topics that are relevant to middle neighborhood practitioners. Today's a perfect example of that. And there is policy analysis and advocacy done by NCST on issues that relate to middle neighborhoods. So let's go on to our next slide, which I think is to introduce Ariel. Ariel Rawlings is a Gramlich Fellow for 2022. I'm sure she'll explain to us what a Gramlich Fellow is. This is a fellowship that's offered jointly by NeighborWorks America and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard and Cambridge. And Ariel is a grad student in the College of Design, I believe. So I'll let her introduce herself a little more extensively. I'm so glad that she's able to join us to talk about her early findings in her research project, which is focusing on Mountain West middle neighborhoods and what's happening to them in the last 10 years, especially around the COVID economy. So thanks so much, Ariel, and let's kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Let me work on sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? I'll look for the thumbs up from Marcia. Great.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And I am very excited to be here. I appreciate the introduction, Marcia. I'll go ahead and kick off. So my name is Ariel Rawlings, as what is introduced. I'm a master's in urban planning candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm focusing my coursework on affordable housing development and housing policy. And this summer, I am doing research under the Gramlich Fellowship, which is a practitioner-focused fellowship in partnership with NeighborWorks America and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, which aims to conduct research on policy or practice challenges that are faced by organizations in NeighborWorks America's network and organizations working on housing and community development more broadly. And when I came on this summer as a Gramlich Fellow, I began working with the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, which Marcia has just introduced. And the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative has focused its work on bringing research, resource support, and attention to the country's middle neighborhoods. So today I'm going to present some of the research in progress that I have worked on and use this as an opportunity to get feedback on it from all of you joining today. So please, at any point throughout this presentation, feel free to raise your hand. Someone will unmute you and you're welcome to contribute. I really am interested in any feedback that anyone would like to offer throughout the course of the presentation. You're also welcome to chat questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A. And so any forms of those would be great. And I know the vast majority of you joining today are from organizations in the NeighborWorks America network or from other community-based organizations. And you all really have an invaluable perspective on what is happening on the ground in neighborhoods across the country. That's much deeper and much beyond what I can access through some of the data I'll present today. So I just want to make sure everyone is welcome to contribute at any point. So before I started my graduate studies, I grew up in and lived in central Idaho for all of my childhood through the end of high school. This is me standing on a pile of Idaho potatoes that had to be discarded by farmers in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when potato and many other food supply chains were falling apart. And I'd been thinking a lot about how the neighborhoods in my town and those in cities and towns throughout the state of Idaho have been impacted by the pandemic. Not just during those very early months, when farmers were discarding their crop, but in the years since then. And housing affordability in Idaho has really taken a turn in the last few years. I wasn't the only one thinking about this, of course. This has been a topic at the forefront of the popular media and conversations on housing affordability and the housing market in the past 2 years. Just last week, actually, an article came out in the New York Times looking at the exact county in Idaho that I grew up in. And it's drawing attention to the crisis around workforce, housing, and middle and low income neighborhoods in the region, which is the exact focus of my project. So all that to say that this seems to be something on the minds of many. I think, I'm not sure how the raising hand function works, but I'll just take a pause because I did get a notification that someone raised their hand. Nothing? Okay, I will move on. So we'll just stop here for a poll. This is another method of mine to get feedback, but just to start us off, what region are you joining us from today? I know some people wrote in the chat, but this is helpful for me to have it recorded. So if you wouldn't mind starting the poll, Anne.
So I launched it. Are you able to see it? Let me know if you guys can see it, the participants. Oh, it just says I have an error. Hold on, let me try again. Sorry. That.
Here we go.
There we
I'm
go.
able to see it now. Thank you. I know there are lots of ways that these regions can be defined, but I pulled this from a source, and that's how I'm choosing to break it down today. Great. I think we can close that poll. Thanks. So I've been focusing my research this summer on the Mountain West that are for reasons beyond my personal connection to the region. So what I'm showing you now, sorry, let me just close out of the poll. What I'm showing you now is a map of all of the census tracts in the Mountain West region that have a median income within 25% of the national median income. And this is using 5-year data that goes up to 2020 from the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey done by the census. And what this demonstrates is that the Mountain West region has, and really has always had, a very large share of the country's middle class. So around half, I think the exact number is 50.4% here, of the census tracts in the region fit within that middle income range, at least in 2020. So falling between 75 and 125% of the national median income. And when we look at the state level as well, we see this too. So I used, again, 2020 ACS 5-year estimates to look at the median income in each state. And when you rank those from the lowest, those with the lowest median income to those with the highest, you see here that Mississippi is the lowest at about 72% of the national median income. To the highest, Maryland here is at 134% of the national median income. You can see that the Mountain West states tend to have a statewide median household income that's close to the national median income. So they all tend to cluster and right around that 100% NMI, or national median income. Again, because my research this summer is practitioner focused, I'm taking a case study approach where I dive more deeply into the work and the context behind the work of a handful of community organizations. And I've been lucky to be working with NeighborWorks Pocatello in Idaho, NeighborWorks Great Falls in Montana, and NeighborWorks Salt Lake in Utah to understand the state of middle neighborhoods in Pocatello, Great Falls, and Salt Lake specifically, and draw out lessons for the Mountain West region more broadly, and for organizations across the country working in cities and towns that have similar dynamics at play. So for all of those of you on this webinar who are not from the Mountain West region, hearing your feedback is actually especially important, so I can understand what of these trends seem to be playing out in other areas across the country, and which seem to be more specific to the Mountain West context. I was even able to visit Pocatello and Salt Lake City last week, and a lot of what you will see in this presentation, especially later on when I get to some of my early findings, was informed by conversations I had during those visits. So thanks to those of you on the call who helped make those happen. So what is a middle neighborhood? Marcia talked about this a little bit early on, but my working definition is that they are census tracts with a median income between 80% and 120% of the area median income, which is also the median income of the metropolitan statistical area. There are many, many different definitions one can take to define middles. This is the one I have centered on, and it's the one that I'm employing, at least for today, but I'm very open to changing it based on all of your feedback. However, it is one I've chosen for a handful of reasons. The first is that most low-income housing programs target households that earn no more than 80% of the area median income, and that middle income or workforce housing programs or households are often defined as between 80 and 120% of the area median income. And so to make my work most useful for practitioners, employing a definition that matches those used in federal, state, and local housing programs tends to be the most useful. Second, the comparison or baseline you use to define what middle income means matters quite a lot, or can matter quite a lot. And I've chosen area median income, or AMI, because it meets this nice middle ground of neither being too narrow nor too broad. Some other work on middles uses city median income as the baseline, which I have found is a little too narrow for the smaller and middle-sized cities that I'm focusing on, since it tends to exclude the suburbs, and in smaller areas, the suburbs can really be a part of city life. And some other work uses national median income. The slides I presented earlier on the census tracts and the state incomes throughout the region did so. It compared to the national median income, which provides useful insights, but can be pretty broad since it includes all areas throughout the entire country, which we know vary quite a lot. So I should note that I did the analyses of the middles that I'm about to show in a lot of different ways, using many different cutoff points and many different comparison statistics, mostly for the sake of time. I'm choosing to focus on the analyses that use this definition here. Census tracts with a median income between 80 and 120% of the area median income. Great, so we'll start here with Pocatello, Idaho. This map is looking at middle neighborhoods from 2006 to 2010 using an ACS 5-year estimate to 2016 to 2020. The middle neighborhoods, so those that are between 80 and 120% of the area median income, are shown in this red orangey color. Those that are higher than that, so over the 120% AMI threshold, are in this gray color, kind of around the outskirts, at least here. And then those that are under 80% area median income, or the lower income neighborhoods, are highlighted in this lighter white yellow color. And you can see there's been this shift in Pocatello. So in 2010, about 55% of this area that I've shown in the map is considered a middle neighborhood. But when you go up to 2020, you see that has changed. So it's closer to 35%. This shift is the most dramatic of the 3 case studies I'll walk through. But I just wanted to start off by kind of visualizing the shift, and visualized a different way. This map is just showing the percent change in middle neighborhoods from 2010. So all the neighborhoods here were considered middle neighborhoods in 2010. And then this shows how their median income changed in 2019. I chose that just to keep the census tracts consistent, because in 2020, census tracts can get redrawn and the comparison becomes a little more complicated. But you can see here, I would say very roughly, the census tracts towards the middle kind of core of the city, the middle neighborhoods towards the middle core of the city, tend to kind of decrease in income. We saw that if I go back one to the map on the right, there tends to be more lower income neighborhoods in 2020, or there are more lower income neighborhoods in 2020. And then on the outskirts, roughly it tends to be lighter, meaning that an increase in median income. However, this pattern can be nuanced. Next, I'll look at Great Falls. So this is the same map looking at changes in middle neighborhoods from 2006 to 2010 on the left, and then 2016 to 2020 on the right. A change from 57.14% middle neighborhood to 42.85%. So again, we see a decrease in the number of middle neighborhoods in Great Falls over that decade. And to show it here, we tend to see a similar pattern. So the middle neighborhoods that are towards the center of the city or more of the kind of urban core of Great Falls, losing income or decreasing in their median income. And then the census tracts on the outskirts increasing in their average median income over time. And last, Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, I think it's important to pause here and just acknowledge that Salt Lake City looks a lot different from the first two case studies I'm focusing on. It's a lot larger. There's a lot, more census tracts as a result. So this can be a little complicated and hard to parse through. But I did look at the change in middle neighborhoods over time. And in Salt Lake, from 2006 to 2010, about 47, closer to 48% of these census tracts were middle neighborhoods. And then a decade later, closer to 42% of the census tracts shown here were middle neighborhoods. And so I think, sorry, I'll pause here and also show this heat map showing the change in middle neighborhoods in 2010, how they changed in 2019. I think something that's different about a more urban context like Salt Lake City is that you see population shifting around within the city from neighborhood to neighborhood in a way you don't necessarily see in smaller and middle-sized cities. Salt Lake City has a much higher share of renters than the other two cities, partially because of its size. And renters tend to be much more mobile than homeowners, and they can more easily shift between neighborhoods. So you see these within neighborhood shifts happening more granularly in Salt Lake City with the kind of increased number of census tracts and the increased mobility of a lot of the residents of Salt Lake City. And so to summarize, all three of these cities experienced a decreasing number of middle neighborhoods from 2010 to 2020, with again, the Pocatello decrease being the most dramatic. But you can see here the data, which shows a decrease in all of them. However, we know that a lot has happened since 2020, and the maps I've just shown, because they rely on census data, only go up to 2020. The Mountain West region in particular has become the hottest housing market in the country, according to home price index changes. I mentioned the New York Times article on the county in Idaho where I came from, where I grew up in. And we've also seen more featuring on the Mountain West kind of housing craziness of the past 2 years, as well as on changes to middle-class neighborhoods across the country that have been accelerated and reinforced by trends and shifts that have occurred because of or in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to pause here for another poll and would love to hear feedback from those of you in organizations working in different parts of the country, what you have observed on the ground with changes in middle income neighborhoods. Great. Just wait a few more seconds. Okay. Great. I think we can close that poll. And then the vast majority of you mentioned that you've seen a decrease in the number of middle neighborhoods. So for those of you in that category, would love to know if you responded that this question is actually framed wrong. I think the question should be if you've observed that there's been a decrease in the number of middle neighborhoods, how have you observed that to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? Excuse the incorrectly framed question. But for those of you who responded that there's a decrease, what have you observed about that decrease and how it's been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? The first option is the number of middle neighborhoods was decreasing before the pandemic. And the pandemic did little to change that trend. Middle neighborhoods were stable until the pandemic, but the pandemic has contributed to the number of middle neighborhoods decreasing. And then some combination, the number of middle neighborhoods was decreasing before the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated the trend and or contributed to the number of middle neighborhoods decreasing in some way. And I'll take a pause here. If anyone who is answering this poll right now, or who is not answering this poll right now, wants to jump in with some observations, you're welcome to. We can also save them till the end of the presentation, but I'll pause here in case anyone would like to explain the answer they chose and a little bit about what they've observed on the ground.
Ariel, I'll pop a question in here while other people are collecting their thoughts.
Yeah.
It seems to, in my mind, the story is different if the middle neighborhoods are decreasing because they're becoming lower income versus because they're becoming higher income.
Mm-hmm.
And in, the quick look at, say, Pocatello and Great Falls, it looked like in Pocatello, they were losing middles because they were becoming, they were turning into neighborhoods that had a greater concentration of low-income households, whereas
Mhm.
Great Falls seemed to be losing at least a couple of those formerly middle neighborhoods became higher income.
Mhm.
Is that something that you looked at in particular, or that you're tracking or thinking of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. I will again note that this is research in progress. And so that is
Yeah.
a really great kind of area of further inquiry that I think deserves more of my time in the next few weeks as I continue on this research track. But I do think looking at these changes, how middle neighborhoods that existed in 2010, how they changed 10 years later, is really interesting and can help us see that more. And so it does, if a neighborhood is increasing in income or decreasing in income, that can change the dynamics at play a lot more, or can really change the dynamics at play. And I will actually go into this a little bit later on about what the organizations I'm working with, tended to experience. I did see, Rob, you just raised your hand. If you want to jump in, you'd be welcome to. You can speak from your own experience rather than me summarizing.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So one thing, we've definitely seen a decrease in middle neighborhoods in Salt Lake City. I think one of the main factors is that the incomes that you're talking about have not kept pace with housing costs. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case, but one interesting thing here, the income rarely keeps pace with the HUD calculations for those AMIs too, we found. We regularly target those that are at 80% or below the area median income, in part because that's where a lot of the federal funds are to try and do things like down payment assistance to help people be able to stay in their neighborhoods and create that middle neighborhoods. And we found more and more and more, especially during COVID with housing prices, skyrocketing, that once, at least what HUD thinks is the middle income can't buy anything. And so, there's been a huge gentrification in that sense. But I also think that, especially when you look at the way, if you're looking at things like city by city, how much fluctuation there is between incomes, especially in an area like Salt Lake, where there's a centralized metropolitan area. When you try to make broad calculations of what the area median income is, you always end up with kind of you always end up behind the times, if that makes any sense, where you're not really accurate to the incomes that are there, which just compounds the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a lot on that I will touch on in a bit, but one of which is nuancing what does a middle neighborhood mean? Does it mean a neighborhood that is middle class, meaning almost all the residents are in the middle class, or does it mean a neighborhood with a mixed income neighborhood where there's a large range and you see low income residents, you see middle income residents, you see high income residents? What does that variation look like? And they could have the same median.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Ariel. And I know you are going to take a look at that later. And it could be, one thing that may be happening is just this continuation of the polarization of incomes. And generally speaking, so far, to the extent that we know anything about middle neighborhoods, it is that they tend to be more mixed income than either their lower income or higher income counterparts. We'll see whether you find that also to be true in your research, but if what we're seeing is that more people who are at the higher end of that income scale are moving out, that's one situation. So anyway, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I'd be very interested to know whether the diversity of income in middle neighborhoods in the Mountain West is something that's declining.
Mm-hmm. I see we have some more people raising their hands, so I'll let someone else jump in as well.
Tamar, for the smaller cities, are you able to say anything about population shifts in those middle neighborhoods? Are we looking at income trends for the same people, or are there inflows and outflows? So for example, was new affordable housing built in any of the neighborhoods that got poorer, or did higher income folks head elsewhere? Yeah, that's kind of exactly.
Yeah, I go a little bit into regional or kind of citywide population shifts in a bit. However, I don't actually have it broken down at the neighborhood level, which I think is a really interesting question. Using census data, we only have data up till 2020. And so, we know that there's been a lot of population shifts in the 2 years since then. And so at the census tract level, it's hard to see through data. However, I think through the kind of qualitative work I've been doing, I've heard a lot of stories about how neighborhoods have changed in the past years in terms of populations. And so that's also something I'll go into a little bit later, some of those findings around what those changes have looked like in middle neighborhoods in the case study cities I'm working in.
And we have raised hands from Jacob and Sherry, and I think Jacob was first. Let's see if I can, oh, there you go. Oh, can you unmute yourself, Jacob?
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I really appreciated Robert's perspective from a larger city and from a smaller place like Red Lodge. Yeah, I think the reduction in the number of middle neighborhoods has come both as a consequence of higher income individuals moving to town permanently. We had a recent or ongoing, I should say, housing study which identified a rather dramatic increase in the number of retirement aged households moving to Carbon County in Montana, with a much more ability to compete and pay for higher housing prices than those households with less accumulated wealth. And so that's become a challenge, even as a young prospective home buyer myself, I just simply cannot compete with folks with the luxury of retirement. That's been one factor that we've observed as a more recent trend, but also trying to compete with either individuals or groups looking to purchase and operate investment properties, particularly for short-term rental markets. So it's quite a challenge to compete with a larger company capable of buying multiple homes at a time when you cannot. So I think the summary is simply just the competition is too steep for those with incomes within that 80 to 120% of AMI.
That's a great insight. That's a great insight, Jacob. Thanks. And Sherry, hi, Sherry. Sherry's from Great Falls. Let's see if you can you unmute yourself, Sherry?
Yes, I'm Sherry. I'm Executive Director for NeighborWorks Great Falls. So sorry we haven't been able to connect on this, but if you could go to the Great Falls slide, I can do some anecdotal thoughts on kind of some of the change there. One of the things that's happening in Great Falls and was occurring before the pandemic is we have a tremendously old housing stock, and new homes are very hard in those areas that are highlighted that have grown. And part of that is it's whether it's usually a NeighborWorks home or it's a rehab, and those rehabs are usually sometimes investors or people that are trying to find housing and are a little bit higher income bracket. But what we're seeing with a lot of those neighborhoods that are under that 80%, that is our target neighborhood.
Mhm.
And our old housing stock is a tremendous challenge to us in Great Falls. And and added to that is the lack of building within the city that is occurring. That's been happening in the, mainly in the county, because Great Falls is not, it has some challenges with foundations and things of that nature. And so those that are in those middle neighborhoods, sometimes they're staying in those homes a lot longer. And if they are not as affluent, we're seeing a lot, some more dilapidated homes that are occurring. And so it's been an interesting challenge. We just did a housing study also for Cascade County that's been very enlightening of the number of new homes, single family homes or rental homes that we need to create in the next 10 years. And it's about, at all levels of income, about 500 homes a year to maintain our growth that we have. And quite honestly, the city has no plan for that. We've been working diligently to see how we're going to help create that.
That's great, Sherry. Thanks a lot for that context setting. Can I ask, I'm curious, for example, of the census tract on the easternmost side of this map that had been middle neighborhood and then became an over 120.
Mhm.
It looks like Massachusetts to me.
Yeah.
The shape of it. You know what happened there?
I think there's just been some growth and some expansion in the 10 years. It's closer to Maelstrom. We've had a lot of different companies come in. One of them was Walmart toward that end of the city. And so that's been where some of the new development has been able to happen.
Okay.
And so I think that's where that's growing.
Just almost suburban.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks. I think we're caught up. Ariel, if you want to continue.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to dive now into some of the trends that have come up now. And again, looking at data that extends us a little bit closer to the current date. So what has led to the erosion of middle neighborhoods in these three cities, Pocatello, Great Falls, and Salt Lake City? And how have those factors changed since the beginning of 2020? Population growth, we see here that resident population in all three of these areas has been decently increasing since the turn of the century. I want to call out Great Falls specifically. This actually speaks to Sherry's comment that we just heard. You can see from the month before the pandemic, it's this graph in the middle, from the month before the pandemic to the month kind of that started the pandemic, there's a pretty decent spike in the population of Great Falls. And so those shifts, those population shifts, new residents coming into an area matter a lot. An increasing population means an increasing demand for housing. So that is one really critical factor to keep an eye on. Another is housing inventory and kind of shifts in the housing market. So these are active listing counts. This is only from 2016 to midway through 2016 to midway through this year. So pretty recent data. And you can see that in all three of these cities as well. There's been this decrease in kind of active listing counts or the number of open, listings for housing available on the market. And so I think this comments to this speaks to a really critical piece of this middle neighborhoods question. For a lot of many years now, the focus in middle neighborhoods has been increasing demand for housing, and you can see why that might be necessary if there's a large number of listing counts, if there's a lot of houses on the market, and there's really important goals of increasing home ownership, especially for first-time home buyers. However, when we see this decrease in active listing counts, that leads to a lot of questions about how we now approach, housing challenges within middle neighborhoods or within these cities more broadly, when there just aren't as many, open listings on the market for as long of a period of time. And then next, this home value index, which has come up a few times. But essentially this graph, this is data from Zillow over the past 20 years. And it looks at the US average change in home values, which is this darker red line at the bottom, compared to the change in home values in the metropolitan areas across the whole Mountain West region. I've called out the top 5 kind of largest spikes, which are occurring in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Those are a bit of outliers, but you can see that the overall trend is that in metro areas in the Mountain West, the home value index has kind of grown at a larger rate than the average has across the United States overall. And so now I wanted to move into some of the conversations I've had with organizations in these cities and understand what, organizations that are working in these cities have been experiencing. And while there have been many complex and changing dynamics that have been mentioned to me over the course of my conversations with staff members of these organizations and other residents of these cities, even just now in our discussion, I've been taking notes over here. I distilled down some of those previous conversations I'd had into 3 of the most cited factors that have led or have contributed to the erosion of middle neighborhoods. The first is rising investor buyer activity, which in some cases also has led to this rising home to rental conversion dynamic. So this has come up a few times. Investor activity constraining the supply of for sale homes. We see that in the active listing count data that I showed before this. Investors in some cases might be holding on to their assets, which means that they, will wait to sell it at a higher price than what they purchased it for. And in some cases, I think in many cases, in the case of Pocatello, Great Falls, and Salt Lake, investors are turning what was once for sale housing into rentals. And so this is, something I'll go into in a bit, but that being a commonly cited factor that has led to the erosion of middle neighborhoods. The next is rising home prices. As home prices rise, more and more low and middle income households are kept out of buying or even living in the neighborhood at all. And that is related in many cases to rising property taxes. Rising property taxes are linked with rising home prices. The implication of that is that the effective cost of owning a home is now much higher. So even those that have purchased a home, potentially even those that have paid off the mortgages on their home, are struggling to stay in place due to rising property taxes. In areas, at least some of areas, more specifically Great Falls and Pocatello, where property taxes have historically been relatively low. So looking across these factors, I have 3 emerging challenges related to middle neighborhoods in the Mountain West. The first, which we saw in the maps looking at census data up till 2020, but seems to have persisted and even grown since then, is that there's an increasing number of lower income neighborhoods in the urban core or the downtown areas of these small and middle-sized Mountain West cities. And one factor contributing to this is rising investor buyer activity, which means that the individuals who own the homes in the neighborhoods, the middle neighborhoods, who tend to be higher income, are not showing up in the demographic data of those living in the neighborhood. If there's a discrepancy between who's living in a home and who owns the home, in many cases, investor buyers do not live locally. Even if they live in the city, they might not live in the neighborhood where they own their investment. And the other factor at play here is the rising home to rental conversion, which has led to more renters living in the neighborhoods towards the urban core, as opposed to homeowners. And renters, tend to be lower income than homeowners. I want to take a really important pause here. This came up a little bit in our discussion. This is not necessarily a bad thing that there are more renters or that we're seeing more lower income neighborhoods in the core of cities. Rental housing is important. Increasing the supply of rental housing is important. But along with that, many community organizations, such as some of those represented on this call, are working to ensure that there's a healthy mix of income levels represented within neighborhoods, that neighborhoods are not concentrating poverty, that they allow for economic mobility, and that at least some of the wealth that's produced by or created by the housing market stays within the communities that live in that housing market, and that it stays within individuals who have a direct stake in maintaining and improving the neighborhood in which they live. So that's one big caveat and something I think we can definitely go into later when we discuss this a little bit more in depth.
Ariel, I think Mike Lofton had his hand up. Mike, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question before we get too far away from what you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a question on I was wondering if you saw the property tax issue that you mentioned on the previous slide, that is maybe resulted in the displacement of homeowners. Have you sized the impact of that? And is that, I mean, there's a conventional wisdom out there that property taxes rising property taxes spur gentrification. But if you really, in my experience, if you really analyze it and read what other people have done to analyze it, it's such a small portion of housing costs that it my sense is that we generally overestimate the impact of it. And I was just wondering if you found anything different, and if you sized what that impact is.
That's a great question. And I think I've taken note of your comment. I think that's something that I need to look into further. However, I will say, and anyone on this call that someone who I've spoken with or had one of these conversations with, feel free to jump in. There seems to be an intersection here between rising property taxes and aging homeowners that keeps coming up in these cities, these smaller cities, especially those that tend to have one, an aging housing stock, and two, an aging population, and that rising property taxes seem to be coming into play when an individual, an older individual or older household is coming to the decision point of whether to stay or whether to move. As there's other factors in that. One factor is maintenance of a home, which is a really important one, and one that I think, based on this discussion already, the aging housing stock is not something that's captured here. That seems to be really important, that I think I need to incorporate more intentionally. So that is a really helpful area of feedback.
Well,
however,
the thing too, I mean, but the issue is, though, what's your alternative? Selling your home because your property taxes are high. It seems to me it's probably very unlikely you're going to find, given how rent has gone up and how 100% of your rent is subject to inflation, whereas property taxes and insurance are the only ones subject to inflation if you own a home. That your alternative would be way more expensive. You're not going to go find this real cheap rental to replace your home, unless I guess you found the subsidized rental or something like that, right? So I just want it's just an interesting issue to try to understand.
Yeah, I think
what's going on there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to add to to what she's working on in the future. I just had a time check. So we have about 10 minutes left. So if I'm going to hold any questions until Ariel gets through the rest of her presentation, and then we'll do a little bit more.
Sure. Thanks, Marcia. So this is something we've already talked around, but this is now just thinking about how these different factors play into middle neighborhood changes, that we also tend to see increasing higher income neighborhoods around the periphery and in the suburbs. So kind of on the outskirts of the maps I showed in the very first section of this. This is partially due to rising home prices. So the income level of homeowners, including first-time home buyers, has to be higher now when the cost of owning a home is higher. And this issue around rising property taxes that has come up, and that I think, there's a lot of kind of new thought I have now on how I can investigate this further. But it does mean that even existing homeowners need to be comparatively more wealthy now than they were before, even if that change is different. And I think measuring that change is really important, or at least have comparatively higher incomes to remain in a neighborhood with rising home prices. I think I'm going to skip this poll and I'll come back to it because that might be a good starting point for discussion. But I will just move into this kind of last primary challenge, which is the erosion of middle neighborhoods in the Mountain West. So ultimately taken together, the kind of increasing lower income neighborhoods in the urban core and the increasing higher income neighborhoods around the periphery has led to this erosion of middle neighborhoods. And I think there's this really important distinction to be made here that I mentioned earlier, which is that middle neighborhoods can look really different. And so on one hand, we have what I'm kind of calling a middle class neighborhood, which is where you might see kind of a narrower range of income levels, all clustered around the kind of middle income, middle class. Or you might have a mixed income neighborhood, which could have the same neighborhood median income as the first middle class neighborhood, but you see a much larger range, and you see kind of all representations of income included within that neighborhood. Let me see if I can switch. And so I think that distinction leads to kind of different implications. And I think that is something really important to keep in mind, that we might, if we have any time left at the end, we might be able to discuss a little bit. But overall, what does this mean? You know, what are emerging goals for middle neighborhoods in the Mountain West? So for current residents of middles, promoting neighborhood stability. And in these conversations with the organizations I've been working with, that I've been focusing on as my case studies, there's many different approaches that organizations take to creating neighborhood stability. 4 that have come up that I wanted to highlight are focusing on increasing home ownership, especially for first-time home buyers, which, you know, having more homeowners versus renters can increase stability. Again, whether that is a goal in and of itself is a separate question. Growing resident leadership and capacity. This is something that was really focused on in the Salt Lake City case study, which I know has a leadership program for neighborhood residents or residents of the neighborhoods that they work in. How can you get residents to advocate for their neighborhoods, and then not only to advocate, but to really, you know, go beyond that and foster other advocates within their neighborhoods. Building community within neighborhoods, which can look like fostering social ties. One example that was brought up was a neighborhood wine club that happens once a month to just foster community and connections between neighbors, really helping people have a stake in the area where they live. And then introducing or supporting rent stabilization programs, which targets renters and allows renters to stay in place and kind of continue to exist in the middle neighborhoods that they live in a similar state to how homeowners might be more kind of relatively able to remain in place. We can again come back to the poll. And then for future residents of middles, which is its own kind of bucket, how do we preserve affordability and perpetuity? So if you're thinking about who has access to a neighborhood, who doesn't live there now, but who wants to live there, who's able to come in, how do we make sure that there's affordability so that, you know, middle and lower income individuals are able to enter into neighborhoods and able to stay there? And there's a lot of approaches to this, but one that has come up is shared equity models as kind of an emerging potential solution or part of a potential solution to supporting middle neighborhoods in the Mountain West. And so this can take a lot of different, you know, models, but one is a community land trust, another is deed restricted homes. Both of these are models that Mountain West NeighborWorks America member organizations are implementing. Limited equity housing cooperatives, and then resident-owned manufactured housing opportunities. So yeah, we can jump into this quick poll. For those of you that work at a organization, a local housing organization, have you or are you planning on introducing any of these models in your city? Great. And then we can end that poll, and there's another related one that I'll jump to. So for those of you that haven't necessarily introduced these models or are not necessarily planning to, which do you think would be a good fit for your city? And part of the reason I asked this is because these different shared equity models are very contextual. And so they work in certain contexts and they don't work in certain contexts. And so I'm hoping to learn a little bit about which of these might work in certain contexts, and then investigate, why does a community land trust tend to work in certain contexts and not versus others? And why does a deed restricted model tend to work in certain contexts and not others, and so on?
I'll add that one of the things we're working on is to do a webinar in the fall that is about shared equity models that are being used in middle neighborhoods around the country. So we'll get to dig a little deeper.
Great. With that, I know I kind of sped through the end, but I will stop talking and leave the last few minutes for questions, comments, anything else. I will also pull up my email address here. If anyone wants to email me or follow up after this presentation to discuss anything further, to give more in-depth feedback, please feel free to. My email's here.
There's a few questions from April that may be questions that you can't answer now, but could be something that you explore further. It has a lot to do with what's happening to renters in the market. So let's see. For instance, are LMI homeowners likely to sell and move to other neighborhoods, or more likely to stay in place despite the increase in property taxes? So that certainly is a mobility issue. Or is it that units for sale are selling at a higher price point, creating an unaffordable environment and possibly leading to displacement? Do you know anything about that now, Ariel? Or is that just something that you may find out in the future? Ariel?
She might
We're
be
not here.
frozen.
Is she gone?
She might be frozen.
Oh, she might be frozen. Okay. Meanwhile, I think she's left and is coming back in.
She'll come back. You've got Mark's hand up.
Yeah. So Mark, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself so that when she gets back, you can pose this question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure can. It's nice to hear you. Haven't spoken to you in a while.
Yeah, good to see you, Marcia. Marcia spent a lot of time in Pocatello, so she knows our community quite well. And, just a couple of comments. That first one, just to concur with Sherry from Great Falls on a lot of things that, we too, in a lot of small cities, I do think grapple with that older housing stock. And what we're noticing is that, we are, especially since the pandemic, an influx of folks, like from the Wasatch Front in Utah and California and other states, that the housing selection we have in our older low-income neighborhoods, that they're not big enough, they're not of high quality, they're pretty dense, and not. Marcia helped us do a study that a lot of our homes in our older neighborhoods, they just have one bathroom even. And so the folks that are coming in, that they're not finding the housing stock that they like, that they want to move, on the periphery of the city where they can get their 3,000 and 4,000 square foot homes. And so in Pocatello, that shift, I think it's just that we've seen in the core neighborhoods are becoming less middle neighborhood and more low income, is that just that push, I think, from, the folks coming in, and that, that income gap is just getting greater and greater in the city, and more of the higher income up on, we call them the benches around town there. And then secondly, that we've had to do a lot of shifting in our models, that it is true that nonprofit housing developer, it's so tempting to take those below 80% funds that you get from HUD and create the housing stock there. And so we've had to shift our focus and be more of like a private developer. And one thing we'll see if this changes the outcome in one of our lowest income, highest rent neighborhoods, that we purchased an old elementary school that took up a full city block and tore that down, and we're really excited about it and building 26 housing units there. But how we're doing it this time is 20 of the 26 homes will be available to low end or all income levels, I should say, with no restrictions on the income, and just setting the 6 aside for the below 80% income. That so just that shift, I think for the last 20 years, we've been just so tempted, and resources are tight, and you want to take the HUD money and the developer fees. And so I think just going forward, we're excited about this model where, like with the Bonneville Commons, that we'll have the deed restrictions for the 20 houses and then the community land trust for the other 6, because it's also very important to keep all 26 homes owner occupied. So, you know, just I think that's an important thing that we're looking at. We need to create higher income housing stock in the center of town, and we have not done that in the past.
That's really fascinating, Mark. And I'd love to engage you even more about that question, but our time is coming to a close. So I just want to call out, we'll save all the other questions that were in the Q&A. I think Jacob brought up something important that's sort of come up throughout the call, which is, can we distinguish between short-term and sort of regular term rentals? You know, with all the Airbnb stuff, this area of the country probably is more vulnerable than most places to that kind of short-term rental conversion. I personally have no idea whether there's any way to, you know, if there are data available for that. So I think we can't overemphasize enough that Ariel is still in progress on this report, and she absolutely wants continued feedback and input on this. All the questions that you posed, you know, we're saving and recording. We will very likely do another webinar with Ariel when she concludes her project. But I want to encourage any of you who would like to talk to her more to just contact her directly, because she really wants that. Ariel, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really intrigued by your, you know, early findings already. Really intrigued to hear the practitioner feedback on what you found. It's such a delight to be able to combine, it always has been for me, sort of secondary data analysis with, you know, boots on the ground experience from practitioners and trying to interpret what that all means. So thanks to all of you for attending as well. Again, I want to encourage you to join our community practice. Just go to middleneighborhoods.org. And you'll find out about our additional webinars, and we're doing a lot in August. So on Thursday, we're doing Centering Black Prosperity in the Revitalization of Black Middle Neighborhoods. And on the 23rd, this has been long in the works, Equitable Place-Centered Strategies for Safer Communities. We're going to have LISC's Safety and Justice staff and some of their practitioners talk to us about what's working the best in terms of safety strategies, particularly as everyone's experienced, so many people have experienced the spike in crime that came along with COVID. We always like to promote our partner, Center for Community Progress, who has their own webinar series, Cornerstone. They always have great webinars, so check them out. And always let us know if you have ideas for additional webinars you'd like to see, case studies you'd like us to write, news stories that you have you want to share, all of that stuff. And we'll have a little evaluation about this webinar as we close out. So do we have, no, we actually finished. Okay, thanks again, Ariel. This was absolutely terrific. We're so pleased that you're working with us, and I envy all of you that are in those cool mountain geographies. I'm in Southern Arizona and it's not cool here.
I know it's not comparable, but it's not, doesn't feel particularly
really
cold in those areas either right now.
Yeah. We have to go up a few thousand feet, I guess. So thanks everybody. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again when Ariel has completed her project.
Thank you, everyone.